Hello, well, thanks for joining me here today. Please do leave a comment in the messages. Let me know where you're joining from. It'd be great to kind of hear kind of where everyone's from and kind of what you're up to in the world. But without further ado, let's kick off. So, elephant in the room. Policy is a dull thing. It's kind of hard to make it sexy, but I'm going to at least try and get your attention. So, bear with me. So, to set the scene, I'm in a lift. Yes, American friends, we really do call them lifts. And four people walk in. I think to myself, Chris, this is your moment, now or never. And as the doors close, I position myself in front of them, a captive audience. They're mine, I've got them. I hear the doors seal shut behind me, and I take a breath. I look to the first person on my left. She's in a suit. She looks really important. I gesture to her. See? She looks back at me as if to say, yes, go on. I? She nods. Oh, okay, perfect. The CIO, the policymaker, the one whose neck is on the block. What are the chances of finding you in my imaginary lift today? I ask her, well, what keeps you up at night? She tells me I don't know what teams are really doing, what the volume of risk, and what I should be showing more interest in. Setting and changing this policy is slow and hard to communicate, and people just go off and do their own thing. They think they know better, and to be honest, often they do, but I'm then left playing catch up with all that risk that they've signed me up to. Okay, I say, trying not to sound like a patronising snake oil salesman. I can help. I turn my attention to the second person, also in a suit, but look slightly less important. I make a guess. Let's face it, this is my imagination. It'd be weird if I was wrong. Product manager, I say. They nod. Ah, the whip cracker, I say. Well, what's important to you? So, managing risk. So, mostly opportunity risk. So, the fear of missing out. So, getting features out the door and avoiding getting bogged down with, and they glance to the CIO, bureaucracy that it almost feels like it's designed to slow me down. Awesome, I say. This is your lucky day. I turn to the next person, dressed in overalls. I'm in a trendy part of town. They could be the CTO. Before I ask, they sense me staring at them. Cleaner, they say. Huh. How did you get in my imagination? Okay, I'll come back to you. My attention goes to the last person. Hoodie, headphones around their neck. Ah, my stereotypical developer. Yes, I know you well. So what code do you write? It doesn't really matter. Python, they say. Cool. Have you got everything updated to work with? I pause. Python 3, they offer? Yes, Python 3. That must be hard. I add. But they don't really know it yet, but I've just won a bit of their trust, which is, as we know, important. Nearly, they say. Cool. Okay, what's important to you? So staying on top of kind of patching dependencies so we can react to the next fire, knowing what rules exist, what ones I can bend, and those that I can break, and ultimately, what might cause me to lose my job. Writing consistent, good quality code, avoiding technical debts, ultimately the rest of my team being able to cohesively work as one. Do you use any tools to help you with that, I ask? Yeah, linters, code quality, test coverage, the usual kind of remit. Great, I say. I write code too. Let's be friends. And I hand them a printed QR code. Say, here's my public GPG key. So you know that you can trust what I say. I return my focus to the cleaner. I've got it. How do you get told what to do and told when it changes? Well, we get a memo or something stuck to a notice board. So last week we got a memo saying that all of the meeting room whiteboards needed to be cleaned every night. Interesting, I say. How does that work out? Well, it's up to us to maintain the to-do list so we can onboard new people. Does that go wrong at all? Yeah, so sometimes if when we compile our operational manual, we miss a memo or don't apply them in sequence, and we do get things wrong. They glance apologetically to the product manager, like when we hadn't updated the guide that the meeting room on the third floor was being used as a dedicated war room, and we wiped all their boards down. I look to the dev. Does that sound familiar? I ask. They nod. So, turns out we're not all special snowflakes. Who knew, hey? All is not lost. I knew there was a reason that I imagined you here today. The lift is slowing. I feel it coming to its destination. Great, I've got the silver bullet for you too. The CIO looks to me, ready to buy whatever it is I'm selling. They ask me as the doors open, who are you and what team are you in? As I move out of the way so to stop obstructing their way, I answer, well, I don't actually work here. I'm just here to fix the lift. People have been complaining it only goes to the top floor, no matter what button they push. And that's actually pretty slow. My audience storms out, furious, heading towards the stairs. The door's shut. And I get back to my job. So, okay, so what if any of that, hopefully some of that may sound familiar, and maybe you relate to my imaginary friends? Well, then I've hopefully got some answers for you. So what if I said that you could update policy easily, even releasing several version updates to that policy, not just in a year, a month, What about 10 updates in a single day and seamlessly communicate that to the people that need to consume it without derailing them? You could have visibility on compliance of that policy using tools you perhaps already have. That policy could be readily consumable, easy to pass, demonstrate compliance, make sense and not be bureaucratic, to change when it needs to be and not get in the way. That same policy could be treated as a dependency and operate like a linter, so you can run compliance checks locally in CI and ultimately guard production. That multiple versions of a policy, like a dependency, are supported. So emergencies like you must update now because there's now known vulnerability type updates are actually just a business as usual activity to communicate and carry out. Sound interesting? Okay, hang around. Let's crack on. So I've hopefully at least got some of your attention. It's time to introduce myself and start explaining things. My name is Chris Nesbitt-Smith. I'm currently an instructor for Learn K8s and also control plane, a consultant to the Crown Prosecution Service and a tinkerer of open source things. I've spent a fair chunk of my professional career now working in UK government and large organisations where problems like these are rife. We'll have time for questions at the end. Even if we run over, there'll be a Q&A that you can interact with me or find me on LinkedIn afterwards. So, while this is not live or in person where I could ask you to perhaps say raise your hands, we can still try some sorts of audience participation. So, bear with me. If you could leave a comment of policymaker in the Q&A below, if you're with my CIO and have ever set, written or applied policy before in any sort of guise. And I'll give you a minute, a few seconds to fill that in. So if you've ever written or applied or have set some policy, no matter what it is, write policymaker in the chat to give me an idea of kind of the audience. Cool. Okay, next round. So, if you've ever sought exemption, or consciously bent, broken, circumvented, ignored, bypassed, whatever, a policy with, let's hope, at least good intentions, can you leave a comment of policy breaker? So if you've ever worked around a policy and circumvented it and got around that blocker in any way, for whatever reason, leave a policy breaker comment. Cool. Hopefully that's enough time for people to be smashing away at their keyboards. Well, you fell for it. So thanks to the organisers of this event, I've actually got all of your names and your employer's details all captured and down. So please, lend me your ears. The stakes just got raised. So, where do I see policy as code going wrong? Well, before we dig into that, what do I mean by policy? Well, it usually comes in one of two forms, I've found. So, security enforcing, like, say, data at rest being encrypted. Or consistency enforcing, such as code style tabs being 2 or 4 space indentation, maybe. Or maybe you can think of some others, but in essence, in case it's hopefully intended to mitigate a risk of some sort. However, with the best of intentions, these are often find themselves being emotionally led, rather than being grounded in a proportionate control, which is the open door to case-by-case exemptions being required when you come against a situation that you weren't anticipating. This is not unlike how the laws of the land are created, with case law making for a complex-to-navigate rulebook and harder still to measure compliance. Now, in the real world, this often looks like the thin end of a wedge, where the precedent, which may have been an uncomfortable pill to swallow the first time round, becomes dangerous, with then others looking to expand upon its scope. Which can lead us to sometimes wonder if the cure was actually worse than the disease. But that's not at least how we typically develop software, so why does this have to all be so hard? There surely must be a better way. Well, we've codified everything else, so isn't that the answer? Well, yes, but my point of this talk is that we do it wrong. Maybe some of you are screaming your favourite product name at me and your or solution at me from wherever you are, but you're not wholly wrong. But the devil's in the detail. So throwing some curly brace or other syntax at a problem doesn't inherently fix things, though. If it's a security control, it's often tempting to keep that policy secret. Exposing it could perhaps maybe be used against you by an adversary. However, that does not support us shifting left at all. It results in devs effectively reverse engineering what the policy is by finding out when we smash our heads up against it. It doesn't take much then imagination to see that in a scenario of an application deploy, midway through finding one of your resources is non-compliant and rejected would leave potentially the overall deploy in an inconsistent halfway state, likely resulting in some downtime. Which begs that question of, was the policy better than the downtime or any other consequence? Especially if it leads our engineers, who are hopefully all plenty smart people, finding inventive, shall we say, ways around the computer says no response that they had got. This is then further exacerbated when updates to the policy are desired. So maybe you get a pen test or something goes wrong, so you form that case law and you need to apply a new policy. So maybe all S3 buckets now need to be encrypted, a change that could be considered a breaking one. Sure, you might say that you provide warnings on at least the less important issues or new emerging policy, which is great, so long as someone sees it. But if you've adopted GitOps or at least CI/CD in any sort, is anyone actually seeing those warnings? Who studies the results of a successful build log every time? Anyone? Every time? Well, if you are, I'd politely suggest you're probably missing the point of CI/CD, and you should be able to trust your job status. Okay, well, I'm not here to just throw stones. So if we remember my implied promises to my four imaginary friends of what this future utopia might look like. Well, there's nothing new under the sun. We've already unwittingly solved a lot of these problems elsewhere. We just need to be reminded and join the dots. So the first is something, if you're doing policy as code, you're probably already doing, which is put it in version control. The thing you might not, however, be doing is then making that visible. So I advocate at least inner source it, by which I mean allow anyone within your walled garden of employees, suppliers and so on to see the policy. I'm not saying kind of give away all your threat monitoring rules and intel away, you can probably keep all that to yourself. But I'd argue that visible policy and the gaps therein is often better than the downtime, reverse engineered workarounds and opaque legacy exemption soup that you might find otherwise. If you're brave, you might even open source it. You'll find it unlocks the ability to work well with prospective suppliers without NDAs and whatnot, and widely distributed secrets are expensive to maintain, difficult to handle, and ultimately often only stay secret for so long. Okay, so we're off to a good start. Our policy is visible now, and it's there available to those that need to see it. So many of you are no doubt used to semantic versioning, but a quick recap. The first segment is to indicate breaking changes, so perhaps a conflicting one. In the context of policy, let's say it's requiring resources to have a department label. So maybe that will help with some internal cross-charging. Who knows? I'm not judging. An increment to that might look like requiring that to be from a predetermined list rather than free text. The second segment is to indicate minor changes that shouldn't break anyone. So an increment to that might look like correcting, say, a spelling mistake on one of the department names. The third segment is to indicate patch changes, so these should be a no-brainer to keep up to date with. An increment to that might be like adding a department to the available list of options. Okay, so our policy is visible in a repository now, it's versioned so we can communicate it, we can tack on release notes, and expectations are all managed by semantic versioning. In software, we're used to handling dependencies, so what if your policy was actually just another dependency of your code and your applications? You might already unwittingly be doing this in some guises if, for example, you have, say, ESLint as a dependency in your JavaScript package, perhaps. Okay, so our policy is visible, it's in a repository, it's versioned so we can easily communicate that policy and we can tack on release notes, expectations are managed by semantic versioning. It's beginning to look a lot more like software. Okay, I know testing is a dirty word, but in order to make this an asset that everyone can depend on and also provide known good examples, tests are essential to give everyone confidence in the stability and surface potential side effects before they ultimately hurt everyone involved. Consumers of this policy need to be able to test themselves against the policy locally and in CI/CD, thus shortening the feedback loop and better informing everyone. So, as a bonus, we should be able to find our consumers able to rely on an artifact we're sharing with them. Well, we're well and truly on the home stretch. It's a dependency, so updating it should be no different to any other. We can even use some magic, like GitHub's Dependabot or Men's Renovate, to do that for us. now white sources renovate, I think. But anyway, so think automatic pull request tests, and if you're brave, also merging. Okay, so to check you're all still awake, can anyone tell me a recent event that caused people to want to know what version of a certain logging Java doohickey you were potentially running literally everywhere in the estate? So leave a comment in the thing below. Yep. As you know, all presentations this year are actually contractually from the organisers required to reference log4j in some guise, even when it's almost entirely out of context, and include some memes about it. In just a few short months, I can remove these and hopefully just point broadly at a list of scary looking CVEs in order to command your behaviour through fear. But what I'm getting at here, though, is that the situational awareness piece around software supply chain is something your organisation is hopefully already thinking about, if not already addressing and embracing. So if our policy is a dependency, this is at least not a new problem. So software bill of materials for the win, right? Which can allow us to measure the compliance across the estate. Okay, so I've just covered a lot of ground and hopefully sounded at least vaguely convincing and not just painted a fictional utopia in PowerPoint. It's time to look at how you might be able to actually do this. And I know you really joined this presentation here just wanting to see a million words on a slide and not just the odd emoji too that you've seen up until now. Okay, so we're reaching the point where I'm going to show you some code. Hooray, you might say. So to maintain scope, I'm going to be limiting things to talking about just two things to prove this is not just one tech or tool. I've arbitrarily picked Terraform and Kubernetes, but I could have probably picked anything. Naturally, I'll need some tools to go along with this. I'm too lazy to invent anything here, so likewise I'm going to pick two tools. But again, I could have used any, some, or even all probably. So in this case, Checkcov is going to be doing my Terraform, whilst Canervo is going to be doing my Kubernetes. If you want to follow along and browse along with me, I've created an example GitHub organisation here. I'm not expecting any of you to read grok the code off the screen, so don't worry about it too much. It's just to prove, I've put it here to show that it's a real thing. So you'll find that the policy is stored here. So here's where my policy starts at v1.0.0. I've got policy that requires a department label on all resources. So long as it's set, it doesn't matter what it is, as long as it is set. I've written some tests for this. Note how the passing test cases are usable as a great example of what good and also what bad looks like. I've pushed a tag in Git. We've added release notes. I can sign it to provide further assurance if my heart so desires. Naturally, it does, obviously. But moving on. Version 2.00 looks similar, only now that department field has to be one of a predetermined list. So, like before, test exists, release notes are written, and tags are signed. 2.1.0 is where we notice and correct a spelling mistake on one of the options in that list of departments. And 2.1.1, I've now added a new department to the list. Some other repositories that you'll find in that organisation is app1 and infra1, and those depend on version 1.00 of the policy. It's not compliant with version 2 or beyond, but how do I know that? Well, I've configured Renovate in this case to automatically make me a pull request. And when there's a new version of the policy, so it's super obvious if I can update my dependency and I can see very clearly feedback about where and why I'm not compliant. I can also see all the pull requests over my organisation, so I can measure the compliance of my policy across the board. Okay, so moving on from that, the other repositories of app2 and infra2, well, they depend on version 2.00 of the policy. However, we could merge that open pull request all the way up to 2.1.1. Finally, app3 and infra3, well, they're dependent on 2.1.1, and they get a gold star from the CIO. Happy days. There is a small touch of magic in how this is actually working, though, and it's not pretty. I have written some bash. Now, don't judge me, even though I've probably definitely written worse than this. What this does, though, is it allows me from my dev laptop or in CI to evaluate my code against the version of the policy. Ideally, this would be kind of less cumbersome, but it is what it is for now. Pull requests are very welcome. And the last piece to the puzzle is managing the lifecycle of the policies and allowing multiple versions of policy to be accepted and also then evaluated within a single runtime. I've cheated a bit here. Kubernetes gives you admission controllers It's not so easy, I found so far, to get the same policy evaluation in a cloud run locally. They've got their own policy code, and I've not really figured out how to be able to evaluate that policy, like Azure or AWS or GCP policy, locally against resources that I'm maybe defining in Terraform or some other infra as code syntax. But again, pull requests, collaboration, contributions, all very, very welcome here. I'm really keen to solve this problem. So, you may have noticed the way the policy is designed and distributed lends itself well to coexist in a Kubernetes cluster, by which I mean more than one policy version being accepted within the cluster. Which brings us to cluster 1, which describes a cluster that accepts all of the versions that we have described so far by applying all of those policies. Likewise, cluster 2 only accepts version 2.00 and greater. And we can automate all of this using kind for CI to deploy the apps and prove the whole thing works. And there we have it, a full org, all done, all compliant, policy all versioned, and ultimately the CIO all aware of what's going on. So this is great, right? But just one more thing. Wouldn't it be awesome if the policy also carried a story, a narrative of why it exists in the first place? After all, if your agile team is even half effective, it will reject anything that it perceives as friction if it doesn't see the value in it. It could allow perhaps our devs to know why they're compliant, and if they want to do something outside of what the policy permits, they don't need any sort of exemption granted per se. They can actually just have a well-reasoned and informed debate with a rationale behind a pull request that they make to the policy. So imagine, if you will, this going through a stage of versions, with risks that inform mitigations, then ultimately manifest as a policy, all maintained as one. So when the risk landscape changes, your policies can move with it. So for example, when some new privacy regulation comes out, or your latest marketing strategy pays off, and you acquire more data, for example. Even if your policy was perfect at one time, the risks and the appetite stand still for no one. We can liken this to over-provisioning, that we might have been familiar with elsewhere, where lead times were long, changes hard, and there is a significant pressure in nailing it first time, which can lead us to hedging bets against what some future state might be, rather than proportionate mitigation to risks that are more tangibly real in the now. And that's where the real culture change is needed, and the execution of that is likely a long series of talks in of itself. Okay, so now this is really over to you. Honestly, the best thing that you could do right now is tell me it's madness, already done, irrelevant, or otherwise unachievable, something my esteemed echo chamber of peers have yet to do. But beyond making some pull requests and developing the theory more, I'd really like to start building a case study with a willing, real organisation, and allow me to swap out some of my imaginary friends for some real ones. But the most important thing I want you to remember from our time together is, and feel free to say this out loud with me from wherever you are, purposeless policy is potentially, practically pointless policy. Which I've been practicing saying far too many times. I'm Chris Nesbitt-Smith, and thanks so much for your time. You're now free to leave. I'll destroy the evidence of your guilt admissions earlier. I'll do my best. Like, subscribe, whatever the kids do on LinkedIn, GitHub, and you can be pretty rest assured there'll be no spam or really much content at all, since I'm basically awful at any sort of self-promotion, especially on social media. cns.me ultimately just points to my LinkedIn. Talks.cns.me, that contains this and other talks. They're all open source as well. Now, questions are very welcome on this or pretty much anything else. I'll be hanging around in the comments section, or ping me a message on LinkedIn or some other means that if you can find me. And thank you so much.